We have all heard the saying, I'm sure, when the tough get going, or when the going gets tough, the tough get going. It's a great cliche. Is it really true? We have all had those moments in life, I'm sure, where you feel like the best you can do is plod. Just pick up one foot after another and try to move forward. And sometimes where you can't even do that. And it is whatever you're facing is so overwhelming. It's like, is it even worth getting out of bed in the morning? And in the worst case, that kind of extreme depression can be debilitating more than just emotionally. It creeps into every part of life. And as we look at hope, this is not a simple, here is the one pill solution to all of those struggles. However, having hope is an essential part to being able to keep on plodding when you just don't feel like doing anything else. I just want to be clear, I'm not trying to offer a simplistic solution to those overwhelming problems, but it is a part of a larger solution. And psychologists tell us that one element that we all need every day is that element of hope. We need hope that can persevere through, something to look forward to. And in the story of Habakkuk, we have an individual, a prophet of God by that name, Habakkuk, who sets for us an example because of the perspective he develops of the world around him, a perspective that is unique and radical, because God tells him things are not always as they appear to be, that helps him develop a sense of hope, even though that hope means he is going to go through the darkest days he has ever seen as an individual and his nation has ever seen as a nation, in anticipation of the Babylonians coming and bringing judgment on the ancient Israelites because of their unfaithfulness. Prophets were not predominantly about predicting the future as they were preparing for the future. You people must live according to the terms of the covenant, or, as the covenant says, there will be judgment. So Habakkuk lived right before the Babylonians came in and took the southern kingdom. Don't forget there'd been a civil war in Israel. The northern kingdom already run over by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom lasted a little bit longer, and yet they too practiced unfaithfulness to God. And Habakkuk is preaching to those southern people from a very intimate and personal perspective that this is going to happen, and yet our hope is in God, in spite of what is going to happen, because we can see beyond the immediate, not what's going to happen, but who is there beyond the immediate, and that is our faithful God. In 2 Chronicles 36, there's this description of the king of Judah, this southern kingdom. And this is the reason why the Babylonians came. This was the motive for Habakkuk's message. He served under this king. And here's the commentary that is made about this king. In 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 4, the king of Egypt made Eliakim, his brother, king over Judah and Jerusalem, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. But Necho, that's the Pharaoh in Egypt, took Jehoaz, his brother, and carried him to Egypt. So there was a king in Judah. He was disposed by the Egyptians. The Egyptians named a puppet king and gave him a new name. You try saying all these names too. Jehoiakim. And he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem with the support of the Egyptians. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. What a great thing to have on your tombstone. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. So God noticed what he was doing, and God still claimed ownership over him. These are still my people. I am still your Lord. I am still your God, and you are doing evil. Against him came Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and bound him in chains to take him to Babylon. So the Egyptians lost their global influence. The Babylonians were on the rise. This king goes in chains to Babylon. Why? Because he was doing evil and leading the people in Jerusalem, in Judah, in the southern kingdom, into immorality, into idolatry, into independence away from God. And God said, if you do that, the book of Deuteronomy is very clear. If you do that, the nations will come and take over, and you will be scattered amongst the nations. And the chronicler says this at the very end. Now, the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and the abominations that he did, and what was found against him, behold, they're written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. And we don't have those books. That's not referring to the first and second kings of the Bible. It's a separate journal that existed back in that day. But his abominations were so excessive, they were documented. And as a result, the southern kingdom goes into Babylonian captivity. Habakkuk lived in those 11 years that this guy was king. And God gives him a message to preach. And one of the things that is unique about Habakkuk is often we will see in the prophets, the word of the Lord came to me, and I was told to go and preach. We don't see that in Habakkuk. We see a very intimate engagement of this man who, in his piety and his dependence upon God, God speaks to him and he shares his experience, the things that he has learned about God. And Habakkuk chapter 1 starts, the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet received. In other words, he was given this sermon to preach. We don't know if he had a vision. We don't know exactly how this happened, but he was given this sermon to preach. And he takes this engagement with God and he writes it in the book we call Habakkuk in 3 distinct sections, which very conveniently for us, the people who have translated this book into English have made it the chapter divisions. Now, chapter divisions are not inspired. Often they're in wrong places, but in this particular case, they're well placed because Habakkuk crafts his message as one large piece of poetry with 3 distinct sections that summarize this message, both of it's almost too late to repent, but you've got to prepare for what is to come. And while what is to come is going to be horrible, we have hope in a faithful God. Hope that will help us persevere through what is about to happen to us. So in chapter 1, we have a complaint. Habakkuk and God have a dialogue. And Habakkuk says to God, I don't understand what's going on. You are the Holy One. How can you let this happen? In chapter 2, Habakkuk makes commentary based on that dialogue, and he philosophizes a little bit about the nature of life and of holiness and of the character of God. And then in chapter 3, Habakkuk makes his great confessional statement of his trust in God. Now, in your journals, you've had a little section from Habakkuk chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3 that really summarize each of those chapters. And we're going to take a quick look at those sections that were in your journals this week, starting in Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 2 to 5. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not hear, or cry violence and you will not save? God, how often do I have to bring this petition before you and before you do something? The implication is Habakkuk over time had been pouring his heart out to God, and every time he prayed and he told God about everything he was seeing, this evil, wicked king doing, all the abominations he was witnessing, the idolatry, all he heard was the sound of crickets. I think we can identify with that, where we've prayed our hearts out to God, and it's nothing but crickets. And it can cause us to ask the question, God, are you there? God, do you care? And in those moments, unless we have a firm and well-founded understanding of who God is based on what Scripture teaches, we can very easily be distracted. Verse 3, why do you make me see iniquity and idly look at wrong. Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed. Justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, and so justice goes forth perverted. The system is broken, and you don't care, God. And why do you make me suffer? I've committed my life to righteousness and justice. I'm trying to do the right thing. No one is helping me out. It's not fair. And God responds to him in this complaint that Habakkuk has. And he says, look amongst the nations, Habakkuk. Take a look around you and wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe, even if I told you. And basically God is saying, Habakkuk, I know. I'm aware of the situation. There is a plan. Something is going to happen. But it is something so radical, so outside your realm of vision, your perspective, your belief system, that even if I told you, you would not believe. And that thing that was going to happen was that the Babylonians were going to come in, those wicked Babylonians. They were going to come in, and they are going to deoccupy all of God's chosen people out of Israel, out of the southern kingdom, and take them into captivity. And that's where Daniel and his friends and Ezekiel and others, those are the people that happened to. Now, to put this into our contemporary environment, to help us understand this would be like a country like Russia or North Korea coming in and invading Canada and dragging all of us back to Siberia or someplace in North Korea, recognizing, Canada is not God's chosen people. I'm just using it as an example. There's plenty of corruption and sinfulness and idolatry here in Canada, so I'm not trying to say we are the chosen ones. But that political sense of being overrun by a third party whose worldview and politics and is so radically opposite that of our own. And we would look at that and we would say, God, what are you doing? This makes no sense whatsoever. That's the sense of distress that Habakkuk was under. Even if I tell you what I'm going to do, you wouldn't understand it. So Habakkuk tries to process this for a bit, and how much time takes place between that and his commentary now in chapter 2, we don't know. But this whole work is very carefully crafted. Habakkuk's one of my favorite minor prophets, in fact, one of my favorite books in the Old Testament, because it is so carefully and intricately written and artistically written. It's a beautiful work of poetry. But now Habakkuk makes a commentary. Presumably he has spent some time thinking about this, trying to understand this. And he makes this commentary in response to what God has said, I'm going to do, and you're not going to believe it. Habakkuk says this in chapter 2, verse 1. I will take my stand at my watchpost, and I will station myself on the tower. So he's using the metaphor of somebody who would be on the walls of a city, standing ready to alert the city if there was going to be an attack by the enemy. I will stand on my watchpost, station myself on the tower, and look out to what he will say to me, and what I will answer concerning my complaint. So, okay, God, I'm going to be alert. I'm going to wait. What do you have to say about this? And the Lord answers him. Chapter 2, verse 2. The Lord answered me, write down this vision. And whether he actually had a vision or this is just prophetic language for the message that he received from God, it's hard to say because he's writing poetically. But nonetheless, God gives him this communication. Write this down, make it plain on tablets so that he may run who reads it. This is going to be so overwhelming. Once people get the news, they're going to want to get out of here. For still the vision awaits its appointed time, and it hastens to the end. It will not lie. It seems slow, but wait for it. Just think about that for a moment. I'm going to tell you, Habakkuk, what's going to happen. It's going to be a long time before it comes. Disaster is impending. But here's the good news. It's going to happen. So, what, can't we do something to divert this? No. And he goes on. It will surely come. It will not delay. Behold, His soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. What a great line. We love that last part. The righteous will live by faith. The Apostle Paul uses that to talk about the nature of our salvation. But we need to understand what's going on here and who the referent is. Who is, in verse 4, who is the he? And what does it mean his soul is puffed up? It is not upright within him. God is giving Habakkuk a study in contrasts. The righteous person will live by his faith. This other unnamed person is driven by something else. And most commentators think it's Nebuchadnezzar that he's referring to, the king of the Babylonians. His soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. And the word picture that's being drawn here, the language that's being used, is speaking of passions. The passions of this unrighteous person are perverted. They're wrong. But the passions of a righteous person is for faith. And he goes on and he explains a little bit more the passions of this unrighteous person. Verse 5, moreover, wine is a traitor and an arrogant man who is an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol. Like death, he never has enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own people. So that's why they think it's Nebuchadnezzar. It's a commentary that this is a guy who's rampaging around. He's defeating nations. He's collecting them, making them his own people, making them his slaves. And he is like the grave. He is never satisfied. His passions are corrupt. He just wants more and more and more. And the contrast to that, to the person, this unrighteous person who's driven by immoral passions, who's never satisfied, who's always trying to accumulate, is the righteous. And the righteous is going to live by their faith in God. Not necessarily survive, live in the sense that you're going to be saved out of this, you're going to survive this, but rather just as the Nebuchadnezzar in his entire motivation and everything he was doing was driven by a passion that will never be satisfied, so also a righteous person should be driven by passions for righteousness. The faithful person is as passionate for righteousness as this unrighteous person is passionate to satisfy his avarice and his greed. And he will never be satisfied. The implication, this is the beauty of the poetry, the implication that the incomplete statement about the faithful one is that just like the unrighteous person will never be satisfied, there's sort of this quiet vacuum which implies, but the righteous one will be satisfied. And it's a poetic device used by Habakkuk to say what he needs to say without actually saying it. So you stop and you think about it and you go, oh, yeah, I get it. And just the device itself has that quietness, that sense of dependence. That's why poetry is such a great way of communicating these messages. Oh, so this unrighteous person, unnamed, but we all know he's talking about Nebuchadnezzar, driven by greed and selfishness and everything that's wrong and corrupt. But the righteous person will live. They will have life. They will enjoy life because they're righteous, but they will do so by faith in God. Even though their circumstances are going to be crazy. Habakkuk, you're not going to believe what I'm doing. It's going to be horrible. But a righteous person, their passion is for faith in God. And then there's this little empty spot, this quiet echo that says, that is what will satisfy them. So this is Habakkuk's commentary. And then he takes that to his confessional statement. Chapter 3 is a great prayer of his dependence on God. And I love this because after you get through the first part, which is very contextual to that moment in time, we come to verse 16 to 19, which just echoes through all of history and is validated by how we see God being faithful to his people. But it resonates with our hearts as well. Chapter 3, verse 16, this confessional prayer. I hear this message of God. I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. I am overwhelmed. I am intimidated. I am afraid, Habakkuk says. And it is very easy for people like me, for pastors, to stand up and to say, trust God. Don't be afraid. The Bible says, fear not, I am with you always. Here is a prophet who's received a message from God, and God has said to him, it's so overwhelming, you're not going to understand it, you're not going to accept it. And Habakkuk confesses, I get this, I understand this message, I understand I need to be passionate for righteousness and to live by faith. Okay, I will be faithful to you, God, but in that faithfulness, I'm experiencing this. My body trembles. My lips quiver. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. I am terrified. I'm scared of what's going to happen. And that stands in contrast, not to I've figured out the solution and I'm just going to denounce that and I'm going to be confident and we're going to walk on water with Jesus. No, I'm going to live by faith. My passion for the faithful one is going to help me persevere through. I'm going to plod, even though I feel these things. I am committed to this passion for righteousness because of God's faithfulness, even though the circumstances are overwhelming. And how does he express that? Verse 17. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food. The flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stables. So whether he's talking about the Babylonians coming in and taking everything, or just the fact that the crops fail, part of the promise of God's faithfulness in Deuteronomy was, if you honor me, if you love me, if you are obedient to the terms of this covenant, you will always have an abundance of crops on the vine and on the trees and the herds of animals. You will be blessed beyond what you can imagine. But, God says, if you disobey me, then the waters, I'm going to turn off the taps of heaven. I'm going to turn off the rain. Your crops will fail. Your animals will die. Or foreigners will come and take it all from you. And that's what Habakkuk is saying here. Even though the fig tree should not blossom, and there's no fruit on the vines, and the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no flood, and the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, this is evidence that God has abandoned us. No, it is not. It is evidence that God is watching and is being faithful to the terms of his covenant. But even though all these things will happen, because I am passionate to be righteous by faith in God, I will rejoice in the Lord. And notice the word Lord is in all caps. I will rejoice in Yahweh, the founder of the nation, the writer of the covenant, the one who promises to be faithful to his people. I will rejoice in Yahweh. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. I'm not necessarily going to enjoy this, but I will keep my passion for faith in the God of the faithful covenant, the faithful God, the one who is the creator and author of all things. God, again, it's in caps, Yahweh, the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's, and he makes me tread on high places. Remember the video that went out in Frye last week with the mountain goat going up the side of the dam? It's like, wow, I could get vertigo just watching that. I hope that's not what caused Lindsay to have her vertigo. I hope that. But you see these, if you've been in any mountainous area and you see these animals, mountain lion or mountain goats going up the side of the cliff, and you think, how can they climb that? Well, this is what Habakkuk is saying. My feet are just going to be like that. I'm going to be able to jump for joy. But wait a minute, Habakkuk, you've just said, God, have you seen the evil? God, what are you doing? God, how are we going to survive this? And God has said, the righteous will live by faith. And even though this overwhelms me, even though I feel fear, even though I am intimidated, I will still rejoice in God. He doesn't say I'm going to be happy because I'll be isolated and insulated, but I will change my perspective from the events happening around me to the person of the God who holds authority over all those things. And I will rejoice in Him and not in my circumstances. I will rejoice in God. I love these verses, and I have spent hours on verses 16 to 18 when I've gone through tough times, when we were on the mission field and it seemed all overwhelming and we were struggling with ministry down there. I've wept over these verses because it just didn't seem like it was happening, and yet God is faithful. I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation, even though my body trembles, even though everything around me seems to be failing. The object of my faith is God. So how do we nurture this kind of hope? I mean, this is great theology, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a theologian out there or commentary writer who wouldn't agree with everything I've said here this morning. It is great theology, but how do we live it? How do we nurture this forward-looking hope? Well, I've jotted down some suggestions. Hopefully something here will resonate. These come from my own experience and from reading about others who've written on this passage of nurturing this kind of hope. Because it's one thing to have the theory, it's another thing to put this into motion. So hope is forward-looking, as Habakkuk is telling us. But the end that we perceive may not be the end that God designs. We have to remember that. The end that we perceive may not be the end that God designs, because it goes on beyond that. And we know the children of Israel did go back into the promised land. They did, under Ezra and Nehemiah, rebuild the city. The Messiah did come. He did go to the cross. He did give his life. He was raised from the dead, and he is coming back again. So the end as we perceive it may not be the end as it ultimately is going to be. And although we can feel deeply and the feelings are real, they do not define the truth of who God is. The end is known from the beginning only by the creator and author of all things. And this was what Habakkuk had to be reminded of. That even though he observed all of this horror and evil going on around him, his passion remained to live a righteous life because of his faith in God. Just like Nebuchadnezzar was passionate for everything corrupt and broken, that same kind of passion drove Habakkuk and others who were righteous to live by faith, even though they were about to go through a monumental change in their economic, social, and spiritual status when the Babylonians came in and destroyed everything in their nation. So hope is forward-looking beyond the immediate to know that the end as it appears may not be the end that ultimately will be, because those things are in the hand of God. Secondly, I think we have to be honest, as Habakkuk is honest, that hope and doubt can coexist. Being intimidated by our circumstances does not mean we are a weak Christian or there's some kind of a sin in us. It means we're human. Peter, he stepped out we often use this example, stepped out of the boat, and then he looked down and realized he shouldn't be walking, he got afraid, and he began to sink, and Jesus saved him. Maybe there's something else going on there, because when we think of the other gentleman who came to Jesus and said, "Heal my son," and Jesus said, "I can heal him from here." And the man, the father, said, "Just help my unbelief. I believe, help my unbelief." Living by faith is a process that we learn as a faith and life skill over time. And in that process, we may coexist with feelings of being overwhelmed or of doubt. That's okay. Habakkuk demonstrates that's okay. We have to remember that the opposite of faith is not a lack of fear or a lack of doubt. The opposite of faith is seeking to be autonomous from God and not being dependent upon Him. But as we go through the process, we can have hope, and doubt or fear can coexist with that. Now, the challenge is to keep coming back to Habakkuk 2:4, that my passion The thing that drives me more than anything is going to be my faith in God, my passion for righteousness. But in that process, feelings are very strong. And doubt and fear can coexist along with faith. It is not a mark of immaturity, it's a mark of transformation. That we're aware of that. We're discontent with that, but we're pushing on. And hope tells us the end is not necessarily as it appears it is going to be. Keep on plodding, because God knows the end from the beginning. And third, hope is honest. And I love this about Habakkuk. He wrote this, I don't know if he knew he was under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, that people thousands of years later would be reading it. But here we've got the journal of an honest man who tells us he had to learn that divine engagement is consistent and always present, even when circumstances say it isn't. God was not ignorant of the immorality that was happening. God was not deaf to the prayers of his people. But his response was something they wouldn't believe. Hope is honest. And to say that we live by faith and establish ourselves, and again, I point the finger at me because pastors are the most guilty of this, that I've figured it out and just believe more and trust more and have deeper faith. What does that mean? Pray harder. What does that mean? Hope is honest. As we walk this journey together, recognizing that sometimes it is a plod, but at the end, our ultimate passion is to live righteously and by faith. So how do we do that? Well, again, just some thoughts. These are things that have helped me. Someday I'm going to tell you guys the full story of what happened when we were in Ecuador. Can't go there yet, still processing in some ways. But God has done some amazing things in the ministry, and it's thriving in ways we never anticipated. But at the time, we didn't see that happening. And these are things that in my personal journey, and again, this is just me talking, things that helped me when I needed to nurture hope. To fill my space and time with things of the divine. Music, I still do that. There are times when I feel like I just need to put on my headphones and make a YouTube playlist and play and listen and sing to myself some of these songs that we sing here in our gatherings. And I'm really happy that at Starbucks, which is sort of my unofficial office, they play loud music there. There's all kinds of noise taking place. So I can put my headphones on and I can quietly sing and nobody can hear me. It's a wonderful thing. I go to the library and it's like, shh, shh, sorry, didn't realize you were listening. Didn't realize I was singing. But filling our space with the divine, whether that's the natural world, going out and just looking at the beauty of God's creation. Sharon and I were watching a video yesterday, a show, and they had a garden. We're showing this garden, and there was a bumblebee and a flower, and it was sleeping. Have you ever seen a bumblebee sleep? It's the most amazing thing. If you listen carefully, you can hear them snore. They go zzz. That's a beekeeper joke, sorry. But it is an amazing thing. Bumblebees will crawl into a flower and they will fall asleep. And you look at that and the intricacy of the flower and of the bumblebee itself covered in pollen, and he's resting. You say, well, if that bumblebee needs to rest in the beauty of God's creation, maybe I do too. Just understanding, reorienting ourselves to the reality of the divine. Music, art, reading, time that's quiet, turning off the news, choosing not to listen to all that is happening. Not because we want to live in isolation, but just so that our thoughts can come down a couple of notches and we can remember that we are filling our space and our time with the divine. Being honest. I love journaling because I can say things in my journal I can't say to anybody else, not even Sharon. I can say things to God and I can put it out there in a journal or write it out in a piece of paper and then destroy that because I'd be embarrassed if anybody ever saw it. But the Habakkuk's honesty before God helps us live hopeful lives. There is no standard. A good Christian wouldn't do this. A good Christian don't believe that kind of talk. Good Christians struggle. Good Christians are Christians who are passionate for the kingdom, passionate to live by faith, passionate for righteousness. But in that passion, there is a struggle. We've got to be honest with that and allow each other the space and the time and the wiggle room to be discouraged, to feel overwhelmed. And that brings me to the next point, to do life with somebody else. Our faith life. It's important to have that one or two other people. And I will never forget the day when we were in the height of our ministry crisis in Ecuador. A very seasoned missionary. He had been born. He was a son of missionaries. His name is Chuck Howard. I was walking across the compound. I was the executive director at the time, trying to figure out how to resolve some of these issues that we were going through. And he came up to me and he said, "Graham, I want to talk to you for a second." As we were walking across, I call it the compound because we had this huge piece of property with all the mission office buildings in it. I was walking across and he put his arm around me and he said, "Graham, if all of this should fall down tomorrow and be destroyed by who knows what, God's glory will still be seen." And I thanked him for that, went to my office and cried. But he's right, and I've thought of that 1,000 times. I don't know if Chuck ever knows, and he's still alive and well in Ecuador, I don't think he knows how profound just coming alongside me, putting his arm around me and saying, "Graham, even if all this falls down tomorrow, God will be glorified." Do faith with someone. And then this last one, right at the end of the story. Think about what is the end we can't see. I'm not a huge fan of country music. I talked about that last week, Whiskey in a Teacup. Okay, whatever. Sort of a spin-off of that is Southern gospel music. Not a fan of that either. But the one thing that Southern gospel music does really, really well is they keep talking about the end, when Jesus comes back. Not all the theological details they sing in those songs are accurate. That's okay. Focus on the end. The end is that Jesus will return, however you want to understand and unpack all those details, but there will be that day of ultimate righteousness and ultimate justice. And before that, and in the process until we get to that, God is as faithful now as he ever has been, and we see his record in the past, as he will be. And we don't see the end. We see an immediate end, but we don't see the ultimate end. Again, Sharon and I went on a hike up this thing in Colorado Springs called the Incline. I don't know if you've heard of it. Google it sometimes. It's like 10,000 miles straight up a hill. And you got to be a mountain goat. No, I don't know how many steps it is or I forget the stats and how high you go. But it's this famous thing that people walk up, all these steps to the top of a mountain peak. And we decided we were going to hike it one day when we were in Colorado. And so we started off nice and slow and taking our time. And you get to the point where it's like, there it is. There's the peak. I can see it. And you climb up and you get there and you realize that's just a little plateau. It's the next peak. So you climb up and you climb and you get to the next one. Oh, they call them false peaks because you get there and you think, there it is. And you keep on plodding and keep on plodding. And finally, after about 6,000 or 7,000 of those things, you get to the top and you see this amazing view. And it's like, wow. But each one of those false peaks can deceive you and discourage you unless you realize there's still something to accomplish if I can just plod to that next one. And know what? That next one now, I'm beginning to understand, might be a false peak. But eventually we'll get to the top of this incline. Then you turn around and you see a vista that would just make your knees melt. Well, they're melting anyway because you've climbed up these 10,000 steps to get there. But it's just an absolutely astounding view. And you realize, yeah, what I saw wasn't really what I was seeing. But that's okay because the end was there. One way that we can use the book of Habakkuk to help nurture our faith and our hope that perseveres. And I'd encourage you over the course of this week, as you're journaling with the other passages that we're looking at, is to make a list of the character qualities and actions of God in the book of Habakkuk. As Habakkuk struggled in trying to understand, God, how can you allow all this to happen? He ultimately remembered the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. There is no other. And the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. But Habakkuk also learned it's a process in learning. The passion has to be nurtured. The passion has to be fed. The passion has to be not just, okay, yep, I think God's greater and God's bigger, but the pursuit of knowing this righteous one who is the object of our faith. That will give us hope to persevere as we walk this journey of faith together.